A young millionaire suddenly passed away due to a heart attack, causing his family to be in great pain. At the funeral, people found his little daughter sleeping in her father's coffin. When asked, the little girl said, "Yesterday, my father called me to sleep with him." The rain had long since ceased, but its memory lingered in the dampness that clung to the iron gates of Hamilton Estate, in the scent of wet soil rising from the gardens, in the mist curling at the edges of the stone pathways. The grand house loomed in silence, its draped windows hiding whatever sorrow festered within. Even the birds had stilled, as if in reverence or fear. Inside, the drawing room was dimly lit, its chandeliers shrouded with mourning veils, its golden sconces burning low. Black fabric covered the mirrors. The air smelled faintly of wax, fresh-cut lilies, and something heavier. Old wood, grief, the weight of loss settling into the walls. Guests moved with careful steps, their voices hushed, as though speaking too loudly might wake the dead. Eleanor Hamilton, clad in deep black, stood by the fireplace, her hands gloved, her posture straight. She had not touched the tea that had been brought to her, and had not responded to most of the condolences whispered in her ear. To the mourners, she was a portrait of composed grief, a widow of quiet dignity, unshaken by loss. But to those who had truly known her, the slight tremor in her fingertips and the way she barely seemed present told another story. From a few feet away, hushed voices carried through the room. So sudden, so unexpected. A heart attack, they said. But he was still so young, wasn't he? Death is merciless. It comes for all, no matter how much they have. Eleanor let the words pass over her. She had heard them before, repetitive, meaningless echoes of a reality she had yet to fully accept. Then something changed. A ripple passed through the air, a disturbance in the mournful quiet, a woman's voice, tense, urgent. "Where is Annie?" The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses were set down with soft, hurried clicks. Eleanor turned sharply, her composure breaking for the first time that day. Her gaze swept across the parlor, the hall beyond, and the grand staircase leading to the upper floors. Annie should have been beside her. The child had clung to her all morning, restless and fidgeting, asking when they could leave. But now she was gone. A flurry of movement followed, the guests and servants scattering, calling her name in hushed, urgent tones. Someone checked the library, someone else the sitting room. The search widened, but Eleanor already felt it, that tightening in her chest, that creeping unease. Then a gasp. She knew before she even saw. The viewing room, where Robert's coffin lay beneath the flickering glow of 100 candles, was silent as a tomb. The doors had been left open, and the scent of lilies was overwhelming. Eleanor stepped inside, her breath shallow. And there, nestled inside the coffin, was Annie. A sharp inhale from behind her. A servant froze mid-step. Annie lay curled against Robert's still body, her small hands resting lightly over his chest. Her hair, golden brown under the candlelight, spilled across the crisp white fabric of his funeral suit. She was sleeping. For a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. The flickering candlelight cast shifting shadows, distorting the edges of reality, making the scene even more unnatural and unsettling. A soft rustle of fabric. Someone crossed themselves. Eleanor swallowed, her throat dry. The weight of the silence was unbearable. "Annie," she called, barely a whisper. The little girl stirred, her eyelashes fluttering, her breath catching on the edge of sleep. She blinked up at her mother, confused by the solemn faces around her and by the tension that had gripped the air. She yawned, rubbing her eyes, then looked around the room with mild curiosity, as if she did not understand what had caused such a stir. And then, in a voice still thick with sleep, she murmured, "My dad called me to sleep with him." The stillness that followed was absolute. The weight of her words settled like a cold stone in the pit of Eleanor's stomach. A murmur swept through the room, a choked exhale from one of the older women, a servant pressing trembling fingers to her lips. A candle flickered violently, sending shadows dancing along the walls. Eleanor took a step forward. Her hands, steady all morning, shook as she reached for Annie, gathering the child into her arms. Annie nestled against her without protest, sleepy, unconcerned, unaware of the shock that had sent ripples through the crowd. From behind, a hesitant voice, barely audible. She must have been dreaming. A woman near the back clutched her pearls, her knuckles white. Someone whispered, half to themselves, half to the room, "Dear God." Eleanor felt her breath come too fast, too shallow. For the first time since Robert's death, she felt something break inside her. Not grief or sorrow, but fear. Because Robert was dead, and the dead do not call the living. The storm had passed, yet the house remained steeped in silence, as if mourning had seeped into its very walls. The air inside Hamilton Estate felt heavier now, like a space that had been emptied of something vital, but still held onto its last remnants. Shadows stretched long across the wooden floors as the last traces of daylight faded beyond the draped windows. A fire had been lit in the parlor, more for the comfort of its glow than warmth. Its embers crackled softly, casting flickering light on Annie, who sat cross-legged on the floor, her stuffed rabbit neatly beside her. She wasn't playing, not in the usual way children did. Instead, she traced invisible patterns on the rug with her fingers, whispering softly, as if speaking to someone unseen. Eleanor hesitated at the doorway, watching. "What are you saying, darling?" Annie didn't look up immediately. Her lips moved in slow deliberation, forming words too quiet to hear. Then, after a moment, she turned her head, her face soft with that dreamlike expression children often wore before sleep. "Just talking to Daddy." Eleanor's breath caught. A response hovered on her tongue, something rational, something easy, but before she could say it, a sharp sound cut through the air. Ring. The phone in Robert's office rang once, a short, clipped chime that barely had time to settle before silence took its place. Eleanor straightened. A mistake, surely. The house was old. Lines crossed sometimes, interference from the storm, a coincidence. Any explanation would do. But her body had already moved before her mind could process it, carrying her down the hall toward Robert's office, toward the darkened room that still smelled faintly of his cologne and aged paper. The desk stood untouched, the chair precisely where he had left it, as if he might walk in at any moment and sit down, adjusting his cufflinks before taking a call. But he wouldn't. The phone, however, was lit. Eleanor frowned, reaching for the device. The screen displayed a scheduled call, one set to ring Annie's room at 9 p.m., just as it had the night before. She exhaled, pressing her fingers to her temples. It was Robert's doing, of course. He had always been meticulous, leaving notes, reminders, and setting calls for the sake of efficiency. And perhaps, in his careful planning, he had scheduled these calls for Annie. Automated messages meant to reach her at night, pre-recorded, a father's way of ensuring his presence lingered. It made sense. It explained everything. But somehow, it didn't. Eleanor reset the phone, fingers steady despite the strange tightness in her chest. She turned back toward the hallway, willing herself to let it go, to accept the logic of it, to move past the discomfort curling in the back of her mind. As she reached the parlor again, Annie had climbed onto the armchair, curling into the plush fabric, her rabbit still in her grasp. "It was Daddy, wasn't it?" Eleanor forced a smile. "It was just an old message, sweetheart. Something he left for you." Annie nodded thoughtfully. She traced the rabbit's ear absent-mindedly, her small fingers delicate against the worn fabric. "I liked it," she said. "It makes me feel like he's still here." Eleanor swallowed. feeling the words catch somewhere deep inside her. "He'll always be with us," she murmured, smoothing Annie's hair. The little girl yawned, settling into the chair's warmth. "He told me I could sleep in his bed if I felt lonely." Eleanor's hand stilled. "What?" "Last night." Annie's voice was drowsy now, slipping towards sleep. "He called and told me. That's why I went." The room felt colder suddenly, though the fire still burned. Eleanor stayed very still, her pulse a slow, measured thing in her ears. "Annie." She kneeled beside the chair. "The call. Was it like this one?" Annie shook her head, her eyelids fluttering closed. It wasn't a message. It was Daddy. The clock on the mantel clicked softly as a log in the fireplace shifted, sending a flicker of shadows across the walls. Eleanor stared at her daughter, at the gentle rise and fall of her small chest, at the way sleep had already stolen her away. A child's imagination, surely. A dream so vivid, it felt real. She exhaled slowly, turning toward the fire. The house groaned as the wind pressed against the old windows, a deep settling sound that carried through the hallways, through the spaces where Robert had once walked. That night, Eleanor lay awake. The silence of the house no longer felt comforting. Instead, it pressed in on her, thick and unmoving. She told herself it was nothing, and yet she did not sleep. The house had grown colder overnight, as if the warmth had been drawn from the very bones of the estate. The embers in the parlor fireplace had long since died, leaving behind only the scent of burned wood and wax. A dim grey light filtered through the curtains as dawn crept over the horizon, but it did nothing to soften the weight in Eleanor's chest. She had barely slept. Eleanor sat alone in Robert's darkened office, the silence settling around her like dust. The desk was just as he had left it, pens neatly arranged, documents stacked in precise order, the faintest trace of his cologne lingering in the air. She had resisted stepping into this room since the funeral, reluctant to disturb what now felt like a preserved moment in time. Yet here she was, sitting at his desk, staring at the phone records displayed on the screen before her. Her fingers hovered over the page, tracing the lines of numbers without touching them. It was a catalogue of routine calls, names of business associates, scheduled check-ins. But it was the last entry that held her frozen in place. A call made to Dr. Langley, 11:47 p.m., the night before Robert died. The sight of it sent a pulse of unease through her. Robert had been a disciplined man, precise in his habits. He did not call people without reason, and he certainly never called anyone that late at night. If he had felt unwell enough to reach out to his doctor, why had he not mentioned it the next morning? Why had Langley never spoken of it? Eleanor's breath came slower now, measured, controlled. She reached for the phone. The dial tone hummed in her ear, each ring stretching time further, dragging seconds into what felt like hours. Then, a click. "Doctor," Langley speaking. Eleanor hesitated, then steadied herself. "It's Eleanor Hamilton." A pause. It was brief, but not brief enough. "Mrs. Hamilton," Langley said, his voice shifting into something carefully neutral. "My condolences again. I hope you're holding up." "I'm managing," she replied, her tone equally composed. "I won't take much of your time. I just have a quick question." Another pause. Eleanor imagined Langley in his office, picturing him adjusting his tie, composing his response before she had even spoken the question aloud. "Of course." "Did Robert call you the night before he passed?" The silence this time was different. It wasn't considered. It was stalled. Then, "No." It was too quick, too certain. "I'm looking at his phone records," Eleanor continued, her fingers tightening around the receiver, "and I see a call made to your number at 11:47 p.m. That can't be right." Langley's voice was even now, firm, almost rehearsed. "I received no such call." Eleanor stared at the record in front of her. The numbers didn't lie. "Perhaps a misdial," Langley added smoothly. Or a technical error. Phones do that sometimes. A misdial. A technical error. A convenient excuse. Langley was lying. Eleanor felt it deep in her bones, in the cold rush of understanding that swept through her. "I see," she murmured. "Perhaps I'll look into it further." "Of course," he said, too quickly. "If you need anything else, please don't hesitate to call." The line went dead before she could respond. Eleanor stayed there, the receiver still in her grip, her pulse steady, but her mind racing. Why had Robert called him? And why had Langley denied it? She was still staring at the phone, lost in thought, when she felt it. A presence. Not a sound, not a movement, just that peculiar awareness that comes when someone is watching. Slowly she turned. Annie stood in the doorway, small and still, her stuffed rabbit dangling limply from her fingers. The dim morning light barely reached her, casting her in shadow, her face unreadable. "Mommy." Eleanor swallowed, pushing away the lingering chill that Langley's words had left. "You're up early," she said softly. "You're talking to Daddy's doctor." Eleanor hesitated. Annie had never asked about Robert's death, not in any way that suggested she didn't understand it. Children processed loss differently. They accepted without question what adults refused to believe. "I was just checking something," Eleanor said, keeping her voice light. Annie took a slow step into the room. "Did Daddy call him?" Eleanor's throat tightened. "Why do you ask that?" Annie's fingers curled around the ear of her rabbit. She blinked once, twice, her expression serious in a way that a child's should never be. "Because he called me first." Eleanor's breath caught. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Annie's small voice was unwavering. "The night before he went away, he called me." The fire in the parlor crackled faintly in the distance, the only sound in the suffocating stillness. "What did he say?" Eleanor asked, voice barely above a whisper. "He told me not to be scared," Annie said simply. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Scared of what? Annie didn't answer right away. She just stood there, watching her mother the way she had the night before, as if waiting to see if Eleanor could hear the same things she could. Then, finally, he didn't say, but he was crying. Eleanor felt something ice-cold settle in her chest. Daddy never cries. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, rattling the panes ever so slightly, filling the silence with a distant, hollow sound. Eleanor knelt, reaching for Annie's hands, and felt how warm they were, how real. "Are you sure it was him?" Annie nodded. It was Daddy. And in that moment, Eleanor knew something was terribly wrong. The weight of something unspoken hung over Hamilton Estate. The kind of silence that didn't simply belong to mourning, but to something deeper, something that clung to the walls and filled the spaces between each breath. The servants had begun moving differently, quieter, quicker, avoiding eye contact, as if afraid that speaking too loudly would summon something unseen. Eleanor noticed. She also noticed how, in the mornings, the maids lingered in pairs while lighting the hearth, how the butler hesitated before entering Robert's office, and how, at night, the halls felt emptier than they should have been. But none of it unsettled her more than her own thoughts. The unease had taken root in her chest, twisting through her ribs with each passing day. Robert's late-night call to Langley, the doctor's denial, Annie's words, all of it had settled into her bones, refusing to let her rest. By afternoon, she could no longer stand the suffocating air inside the house. She took to the gardens, wrapping her coat tighter around herself as she stepped onto the damp stone path. The wind had shifted, carrying the crisp scent of earth, leaves, and something faintly metallic. The greenhouse loomed in the distance, its glass panes streaked with the remnants of last night's rain. She walked without a destination, letting the rhythm of her footsteps settle the noise in her mind. But it didn't. Not when her memories followed her so closely. Robert had been himself the last time they walked these grounds together. Or at least he had tried to be. She could still see it. The way he had rubbed his wrist absently, how his breathing had hitched just slightly before smoothing over as if he had forced his body to behave. "You look pale," she had told him. Nonsense. He had smiled, though it hadn't quite reached his eyes. Too much work. Too little time. And she had let it go. Because Robert never complained. Because Robert never got sick. A gust of wind tugged at her coat as she reached the hedge-lined path near the east wing. That was when she saw Grayson, the estate's gardener, hunched over a row of rose bushes, his gloved hands moving methodically through the soil. He didn't look up immediately, but she knew he had seen her. Eleanor hesitated, then spoke. "Grayson." He exhaled through his nose, finally straightening. His movements were slower than she remembered, though whether that was from age or something heavier, she wasn't sure. "Mrs. Hamilton," he greeted, pulling off his gloves. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, "You saw Robert before he—" She stopped short, hating the finality of the words. Grayson wiped his palms against his coat. "I did." "Did he seem well?" His gaze flickered over her, careful now. He wasn't a man prone to gossip, but he had served the Hamilton family for decades. He knew better than most how to read between the lines. "He was quieter than usual," Grayson said, seemed lost in thought. Eleanor's breath fogged in the cold air. "Did he say anything to you?" A hesitation. "Not much. Just that he wasn't sleeping well." The words settled over her like a weight. "Anything else?" Grayson sighed, looking down at the half-pruned rosebush. "He had a moment, a few days before. We were walking the grounds and he stopped, put a hand to his chest, just here." He pressed his palm against his ribs, then to his wrist, like he was checking his pulse. Eleanor's pulse thrummed in her ears. What did he say? That it was nothing. She swallowed, hard. Grayson hesitated again, then added, "But the way he stood there, just for a second, I don't know, Mom. It didn't seem like nothing." A shiver ran through her, but not from the cold. What if it hadn't been a heart attack at all? What if Robert had known something was wrong and had tried to say something before it was too late? Grayson watched her carefully. "Something on your mind, Mrs. Hamilton?" She forced a thin smile. "Just memories." Grayson didn't push. "Let me know if you need anything." She nodded and turned back toward the house. Her hands had started to tremble. The unease followed Eleanor like a second shadow. It was there in the dim corridors of Hamilton Estate, lingering in the pauses between conversations, in the hesitant glances exchanged by the staff. It was there in the way the air felt heavier, thicker, as if the walls themselves held their breath. She had lived in this house for years, had memorized the creaks of the wooden floorboards, the soft hum of the chandeliers, the rhythm of life that pulsed through its halls. But now, something had shifted. She could feel it in her bones. The only way forward was the truth, and she knew exactly where to start. Dr. Calloway's office was tucked away in a quiet part of town, a modest space filled with old books and the scent of antiseptic. It was nothing like the sterile, impersonal clinics Eleanor had been expecting. The walls were lined with shelves cluttered with medical journals, anatomical sketches, and an assortment of glass vials neatly labeled in ink. The man himself was just as meticulous. Dr. Calloway was in his 50s, with a neatly trimmed beard and sharp, intelligent eyes that had seen more than they let on. When Eleanor entered, he didn't waste time with small talk. He simply gestured for her to sit, flipping through a file with slow precision. He didn't speak immediately, which only made the tension in Eleanor's chest tighten. Then, with a sigh, he set the papers down. "Mrs. Hamilton," he began, his voice calm but firm. "There's something you need to know." Eleanor's fingers clenched in her lap. Go on. Calloway took a measured breath. Your husband's symptoms, as recorded in his medical report, chest pain, dizziness, the sudden collapse, do not align with a simple heart attack, at least not one caused by natural causes. The room suddenly felt smaller. What are you saying? Calloway folded his hands. He wasn't looking at her like a grieving widow. He was looking at her like someone who needed to hear the truth, whether she was ready for it or not. The tests indicate the presence of cyanide in his system. The words hit like a physical blow. Eleanor barely registered her own breath, sharp and uneven. That's impossible. It's not, Calloway said, his tone carefully measured. Cyanide poisoning mimics a heart attack. It causes respiratory failure, cardiac arrest. In small enough doses, it wouldn't have been immediately obvious. It's why his symptoms might have seemed vague at first, fatigue, discomfort. But by the time it took full effect, it would have been too late. The room blurred slightly at the edges. You're saying someone... She couldn't finish the sentence. Calloway nodded grimly. I'm saying your husband was poisoned, Mrs. Hamilton. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't natural. Robert Hamilton was murdered. Eleanor pressed a hand against her mouth, inhaling sharply through her nose. The thought had been lurking beneath the surface, whispering at the edges of her mind, refusing to be acknowledged. But hearing it spoken aloud, real, undeniable, was something else entirely. Murder. The word clung to the air, poisoning it. Do you have any idea who could have done this? Calloway asked. Eleanor barely heard him. Her mind was already working. She thought of Robert's late-night call to Dr. Langley, the one he had denied receiving. She thought of Langley's too quick dismissal, his perfectly measured words. She thought of Robert pressing his wrist, rubbing his chest as if trying to ward off an invisible weight. She thought of Grayson's words in the garden, how Robert had stopped mid-step, just for a second, just long enough for something to be wrong. Langley had been the one to confirm Robert's cause of death. Langley had been the one to insist there was no need for an autopsy. Langley had been the only doctor Robert had trusted. Eleanor felt a slow, ice-cold clarity settle into her veins. Mrs. Hamilton, she blinked, looking up at Calloway. There's only one person who can answer that question, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Calloway studied her, then gave a slow, understanding nod. Dr. Langley. Eleanor's hands trembled, but not from grief. If this was true, Robert hadn't just died. He had been murdered, and she intended to find out who had done it. Eleanor had spent years mastering the art of poise. She had attended countless galas, hosted dignitaries, stood beside Robert as they navigated the world of the wealthy and powerful. She had learned how to hold herself together, even when she wanted to shatter. Today, she drew on that skill. She walked into Dr. Langley's office with slow, deliberate steps, keeping her breathing even, her hands steady at her sides. The room smelled of stale coffee and sterilized air, the scent of antiseptic clinging to the walls. A bookshelf lined one side, stacked with unread medical journals, their spines untouched, their pages crisp. Langley was behind his desk, half-moon glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. When he looked up, his smile was instant, but it didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Hamilton, he greeted smoothly, rising to shake her hand. She didn't take it. Dr. Langley, she said, her voice even. A flicker of hesitation crossed his face before he lowered himself back into his seat. Please sit. She did, folding her hands in her lap. She didn't bother with pleasantries. I had a private forensic examination done. Langley blinked. The air between them shifted. Excuse me? On Robert's remains, she clarified. His fingers twitched slightly where they rested on his desk, a small movement, almost imperceptible. That seems rather unnecessary, he said carefully. Eleanor tilted her head. Unnecessary. Langley exhaled, leaning back in his chair as if amused. I understand grief, Mrs. Hamilton. It makes us desperate to find answers, to look for reasons beyond what's in front of us. She let the words sit there, let him think she was still that widow, grieving, vulnerable, looking for someone to tell her it was all a mistake. Then she dropped the facade. Dr. Calloway found cyanide in Robert's system. The color drained from Langley's face. His hand darted toward the papers on his desk, as if searching for something to ground himself. That... His voice faltered, then steadied. That's impossible. Eleanor watched him closely now, cataloguing the way his fingers gripped the desk's edge, the way his left foot tapped ever so slightly beneath the table. And yet, it's true. A silence stretched between them, thick and pressing. Langley swallowed, the movement visible at his throat. Mrs. Hamilton, I don't know what you think you've uncovered, but I can assure you. Robert called you the night before he died. The words landed like a sharp blade. Langley stilled, his fingers curled, knuckles white against the wood of his desk. That's not... He shook his head quickly, as if trying to reset the conversation. No, he didn't. Eleanor pulled a folded page from her coat pocket and laid it on his desk. It was a copy of the call log from Robert's phone. Then explain this. Langley didn't reach for the paper. He just stared at it, the muscle in his jaw twitching. Maybe it was an accident, he said finally. A misdial. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice quiet but cutting. You didn't even check the timestamp, yet you already have an excuse. Langley's nostrils flared. He shifted in his chair, his carefully composed expression beginning to crack. What exactly are you accusing me of? He asked, his voice low. I don't know yet, Eleanor admitted, but you're lying. That much is clear. His hands trembled slightly just for a second before he flattened them against the desk. Mrs. Hamilton, be very careful about the accusations you throw around. She met his gaze, unflinching. I don't throw accusations, Doctor. Langley, I collect facts. Silence. Langley inhaled slowly, exhaled even slower. Then, just like that, he smoothed his expression, the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life hiding behind professionalism. I think you need to take some time, he said, his voice soft now, almost patronizing. Losing a husband is difficult. I'd hate for you to waste your energy on baseless speculation. Eleanor held his gaze. She saw through him now. She stood, adjusting her coat. I'll leave you to your work then, she said, voice even. Langley nodded once. But Eleanor saw it, the tightness at the corners of his mouth, the way his fingers curled slightly against his desk, the way his breath was just a little too controlled. Fear. It was there, beneath the surface. She didn't need his confession. His fear was proof enough. If you come here and feel outraged by Edward's behavior, leave a comment, fresh milk. The river stretched before Eleanor, dark and endless, its surface barely rippling under the weight of the night. She sat in the car, her fingers resting motionless against the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the water. The soft hum of the engine was the only sound in the vast stillness. She had driven without thinking, winding through the empty streets, past the iron gates of Hamilton Estate, past the familiar landmarks of a city she no longer felt a part of. And now she was here, alone. She exhaled a slow, measured breath. She had never considered herself weak. Not when she had married into the Hamilton name, not when she had learned to navigate a world that had never truly been hers. But tonight, sitting by the river, she admitted something she had never dared to before. There had been a moment, after Robert's funeral, in the oppressive silence of their bedroom, when she had thought about following him. The grief had been too vast, too suffocating, the weight of it pressing against her ribs until she had struggled to breathe. What was left without him? Without the life they had built together, But then there had been Annie, and Annie still needed her. Eleanor forced herself upright, gripping the wheel until her knuckles whitened. No more weakness. Robert had been murdered. That was no longer a question. And now she needed to find out who had wanted him dead. That night, she returned to the study, the space still thick with the scent of aged books and lingering traces of Robert's cologne. She had spent years watching him sit at this very desk, going through paperwork, making decisions that had shaped their lives. But what had he known in those final hours? She spread the papers before her, each detail more damning than the last. Cyanide, a poison that mimicked a heart attack, a falsified cause of death. Signed by Dr. Langley, a phone call, placed at 11:47 p.m. Never acknowledged. A man, desperately trying to reach someone before it was too late. Her gaze drifted to a photograph on the desk, Robert and Edward, side by side at a gala, champagne in hand. She traced her fingers over the frame, remembering the way Robert had always spoken of his brother with unwavering trust. Edward has ambition, but he would never betray me. Wouldn't he? Eleanor's pulse quickened. Who benefited most from Robert's death? The answer was clear. Edward Hamilton. Edward had always wanted more power, more wealth, more control over the Hamilton legacy. But Robert had stood in his way. Robert had always been the favored one, the younger brother who inherited their father's empire, the one who had the final say in the family's business dealings. Eleanor had never considered Edward dangerous before. He was charming in a way that Robert was not, more polished, more calculated. But that charm had always been a tool, something he wielded with precision. Now, she could see it for what it was, a mask. Had Edward known? Had he realized that his safety net was about to be cut away? The very idea made her stomach tighten. She reached for the documents in front of her, Robert's will, financial statements, estate holdings. The ink on the most recent amendments had barely dried. Just weeks before his death, Robert had adjusted his will, and Edward had been left with nothing. The house, the businesses, the inheritance. Everything had gone to Eleanor and Annie. Edward had stood in this very room during the reading of the will, his jaw tight, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. She had thought then that it was just his usual frustration. Had it been something more? She sifted through Robert's most recent documents, searching for anything that might link Edward to what had happened. And then she found it. A contract, unsigned, buried beneath a stack of financial reports, a transfer of ownership. If Robert had signed it, Edward would have gained control over Hamilton Industries, stripping Eleanor and Annie of any claim to the estate. But Robert hadn't signed it. Instead, he had died. Eleanor sat back, staring at the document in her hands, her heart pounding. Robert had refused. And now Robert was gone. The pieces fit too perfectly. Langley had been the one to cover it up. But Edward had been the one to set it in motion. Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a cold, unwavering determination. Robert had been murdered for his empire, and Edward Hamilton was going to pay. The chandeliers in the Hamilton estate's grand ballroom burned bright, their golden glow reflecting off the polished marble floors. Laughter and the clinking of glasses filled the vast space as men in tailored suits and women draped in silk moved effortlessly from one conversation to another. Edward Hamilton stood at the center of it all. He had always been a man of flawless presentation, the type who wore his grief as a well-fitted suit, just enough to seem respectable, but never enough to appear vulnerable. Tonight, as he moved through the gathering, shaking hands and offering somber smiles, he was every bit the mourning brother. And Eleanor watched him. She stood near the edge of the room, a glass of untouched champagne in her hand, her eyes trained on Edward's performance. She noted the practiced way his brows furrowed when someone offered their condolences, the careful pause he gave before answering, as if burdened by loss. It was calculated, rehearsed. Not once did she see genuine sorrow. Eleanor didn't approach him. Not yet. Instead, she observed, waiting for the right moment, knowing that this was Edward's game: appearances, influence, control. He was an expert at charming those who mattered, at making sure the right people saw him in the right light. And tonight, this gathering was no different. But Eleanor wasn't here to play his game. She was here to end it. Across the room, Detective David Wallace stood near the bar, swirling the amber liquid in his glass without drinking it. His presence was subtle, his gaze flickering from Edward to the men he was speaking to. Eleanor had known David for years. He was one of the few people Robert had ever trusted outside the family. He wasn't just a detective, he was an old friend, a man who knew when to listen, when to wait, and when to act. Earlier that evening, before arriving at the gathering, she had met with him in secret. "I need you to dig into Edward," she had told him, sliding a folder of documents across the table. David had studied her for a moment, then glanced down at the papers. "You already suspect him?" "I need proof." He had flipped through the pages, financial records, contract amendments, a timeline of Robert's final days. His expression darkened as he reached the unsigned transfer of ownership. He stood to gain everything. And he did, Eleanor had said quietly, but only after Robert refused to give it to him willingly. David had closed the folder. "I'll look into his finances. If there's something buried, I'll find it." Now, standing in the ballroom, Eleanor didn't need to speak to him to know he was already gathering what they needed. She exhaled, turning her attention back to Edward. He had moved to a smaller group now, executives from Hamilton Industries, men who had once answered to Robert. They leaned in as Edward spoke, nodding at his words, their expressions shifting from sympathy to business interest. Eleanor's stomach tightened. This wasn't about Robert anymore. Edward was already laying the groundwork for his takeover. She stepped forward, weaving through the crowd, closing the space between them. Edward caught sight of her just as she reached the edge of the conversation. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his eyes: surprise, annoyance, calculation. Then he smiled. "Eleanor," he greeted smoothly, his voice warm, easy, as if nothing had changed, as if they were merely two people caught in a shared grief. "I was hoping to see you tonight." She held his gaze, her own expression unreadable. "I'm sure you were," she said, voice level. A quiet tension settled between them. Edward gestured toward the terrace doors. "Shall we talk?" She didn't hesitate. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant scent of rain and the salt of the river beyond the city. The noise of the party dimmed as the heavy doors closed behind them. Edward took a slow sip of his drink, then exhaled. "You've been looking into things, haven't you?" Eleanor didn't flinch. "I have." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I knew you wouldn't let it rest." "Robert was murdered," she said, watching him carefully. Edward didn't even blink. "That's a bold accusation," he murmured, swirling the liquid in his glass. "And one without evidence." "I'll find it." He sighed, looking almost amused. "You think I had something to do with this?" "I think you had everything to do with this." Edward leaned against the railing, his expression carefully neutral, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, something she had never noticed before. "You always were clever, Eleanor," he said softly. "But tell me, what happens when you find nothing?" "I won't." A pause. Then Edward smiled. "Then I suppose we're both in for quite the fight." Eleanor studied him. He wasn't denying it. Not really. She had expected him to protest, to act offended, to deflect. Instead, he was testing her, gauging her, waiting to see how far she was willing to go. She took a step closer. "Robert trusted you," she said. "He believed you were family before anything else. But you betrayed him." Edward's smile faded. For the first time that evening, his carefully composed mask cracked, just for a moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, he downed the rest of his drink and set the glass aside. "I think you should go home, Eleanor," he said quietly. "I think you should be afraid," she replied. His jaw tightened, his fingers flexing against the railing. She had struck a nerve. Eleanor turned without another word, walking back toward the ballroom, toward the people, toward the world that was still watching. Edward wasn't untouchable, and tonight, for the first time, he knew it. The city was still damp from the night's rain, the streets washed clean, the air crisp with the lingering scent of wet stone and earth. Eleanor Hamilton sat at a small table in the back of an old cafe, her hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee, her pulse steady but tight. Across from her, Agatha Carter sat in quiet contemplation. She was older now, her hands marked by time, her hair streaked with silver. But her eyes, sharp, intelligent, knowing, had not dulled. Eleanor had known her for years. Agatha had worked for Edward before Robert's death, had been part of the world where secrets were buried under fine rugs and behind locked study doors. And tonight, Eleanor needed her to speak. She exhaled slowly, her voice calm but urgent. "Agatha, I wouldn't be here if it weren't important." Agatha stirred her tea, watching the steam rise, as if weighing the cost of what was being asked of her. "I know why you came, Mrs. Hamilton." Her voice was steady, but there was something else beneath it. Fear, hesitation, an old instinct to stay out of affairs that did not belong to her. Eleanor leaned in, lowering her voice. "Robert was murdered. I have proof." Agatha's stirring slowed. "Doctor?" Calloway confirmed it. "The forensic report shows cyanide in his system." Eleanor's hands tightened around her cup. "Langley falsified the cause of death. He covered it up for Edward." Agatha's expression didn't change, but her fingers trembled slightly as she set her spoon down. "I need you to tell me what you heard that night in Edward's house." For a long moment, Agatha said nothing. Eleanor could feel her slipping away, the fear creeping back in, the years of being silent, of knowing that in houses like the Hamilton estate, those who spoke too much often paid the price. So Eleanor did something she had never done before. She begged. "Please, Agatha, I beg you." Her voice cracked just slightly. "Robert trusted you. You were part of our lives. You saw him every day. If you ever cared for him, if you ever cared for Annie, please don't let them get away with this." Agatha's lips parted slightly, her breath catching, as if Eleanor's words had struck something deep inside her. The cafe was quiet. The rain had stopped, but the weight of the storm had not lifted. Finally, Agatha exhaled. "I was there the night they planned it." Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribs. "Edward and Langley?" Agatha nodded. Her voice was lower now, as if speaking the words might summon something dangerous. "I had gone to Edward's house to clean. I left my cloth in his study. When I stepped inside, I heard voices. I was about to turn away, when I heard Dr. Langley say something." She swallowed, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. He said, "It's already in motion. You'll have what you want soon enough." Eleanor inhaled sharply, waiting, needing more. "And Edward?" Agatha's expression hardened. He laughed, said something about guaranteed wealth, and that all Langley had to do was make sure it looked natural. The world tilted. Eleanor gripped the table, grounding herself, trying to process what she had always suspected, but never had proof of until now. "They killed him," she whispered. Agatha nodded, her throat working as she swallowed. "Yes. They talked about switching the pills or putting some kind of poison in the capsules of Robert's sedative prescription." The air between them thickened. David Wallace, sitting beside Eleanor, broke the silence. "You understand what this means, Miss Carter. If you testify, we can open a full investigation." Agatha hesitated, and Eleanor saw it again, that fear, that hesitation. "Agatha," she said, her voice shaking now, not with fear, but with rage. "They are going to get away with it unless you help me, unless we stop them." Agatha looked at her for a long time. Then, finally, a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I'll testify." The police station was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. Eleanor, David, and Agatha sat across from Detective Harris, a seasoned investigator with tired eyes and a sharp mind. Agatha's voice did not waver as she repeated everything: the overheard conversation, the way Edward had spoken with certainty, as if Robert's death had already been decided. David slid a folder across the desk. "These are Dr. Calloway's forensic reports. Cyanide was found in Robert's system. Langley signed a falsified death certificate. And now we have a witness placing Edward in direct conspiracy." Harris flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening. "This is serious," he said finally, "and dangerous." Eleanor met his gaze. "I know." Harris exhaled, pushing his chair back. "We'll open an official investigation into Edward Hamilton and Dr. Langley. But you need to be careful. If Edward knows we're coming, he won't go down quietly." Eleanor's fingers curled into fists. Let him fight. She wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time since Robert's death, she knew the truth. And now, Edward would know it too. The first light of dawn barely touched the sky when the convoy of police vehicles rolled through the grand iron gates of Hamilton Estate, their red and blue lights cutting through the early morning mist. The gravel crunched beneath their tires as uniformed officers moved swiftly and silently, their faces set in hard lines. From the second-floor window of Robert's study, Eleanor watched. Her fingers gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. The room was still filled with the faint scent of aged books and wood polish, yet her heart pounded violently in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. "You don't have to watch," David Wallace said softly, standing beside her. Eleanor didn't look away. "Yes, I do." Inside the estate, Edward Hamilton was still asleep. The knock at his door was loud, firm, and undeniable. A muffled groan, a rustle of sheets. Then, silence. A moment later, the door burst open. Edward shot up, his breath shallow, confused, the morning light filtering through the heavy curtains. He blinked at the figures standing in his bedroom, officers in crisp uniforms, their presence commanding, unyielding. "What the hell is this?" His voice was rough with sleep, but beneath it, something else. A flicker of recognition, of understanding. He knew. Detective Harris stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Edward Hamilton, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." The room went still. For a split second, something flashed in Edward's eyes. Shock, anger, calculation. But then, his mask slipped back into place. He exhaled slowly, pushing back the silk covers. Smooth, measured, controlled. "This is absurd," he said, rising from the bed, running a hand through his tousled hair. "You have no idea what you're doing." "We know exactly what we're doing," Harris countered, holding out the warrant. "Your housekeeper, Agatha Carter, has testified. She heard everything." A small twitch at Edward's jaw, the first crack. "Agatha?" His voice was almost amusing. "You're basing this on the word of a senile old woman." "We also have forensic evidence," David Wallace added, stepping forward. "Cyanide in Robert's system, pills tampered with, a falsified death certificate, signed by Langley. We have Langley in custody. He will soon confess what he knows to get a reduced sentence." Edward stilled. For the first time, the well-practiced ease in his expression faltered. "This is a mistake," he said. "No," Eleanor's voice cut through the tension. "The mistake was thinking you'd get away with it." Edward turned his head slowly, his gaze locked onto hers. For years, he had looked at her as nothing more than Robert's wife, someone to charm, to manipulate when necessary. But now he saw her for what she had become, his reckoning. A slow, bitter smile curled his lips. "You really think you've won, Eleanor?" She stepped forward, meeting his gaze without fear. "I don't think," she whispered. "I know." The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked into place. Edward exhaled a sharp breath, half a laugh, half something else. Resignation. As the officers turned him toward the door, he paused, just slightly, leaning toward Eleanor. "Be careful," he murmured, voice barely audible. "The real enemy isn't always the one in cuffs." She didn't flinch. Edward was led through the hall, past the watchful eyes of the staff, their whispers curling like smoke through the corridors. But before he could be taken outside, "Uncle Edward," a small voice. The entire world stilled. Standing at the top of the staircase, Annie clutched her stuffed rabbit to her chest, her curls messy from sleep. Her big, innocent eyes were filled with confusion as she looked at Edward. Her uncle, the man who had once held her hand at family gatherings, who had whispered secrets and slipped her candy when her parents weren't looking. She didn't understand. Eleanor's heart twisted violently. Annie looked at her mother now, her voice small. "Why are they taking Uncle Edward?" Eleanor's throat tightened painfully. How could she explain? How could she shatter her daughter's innocence with the truth? She walked toward Annie, kneeling before her, gently brushing a curl from her face. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "sometimes people do bad things, and when they do, they have to be punished." Annie's lip quivered. "Even family," she whispered. Eleanor's eyes burned. "Even family." Annie lowered her gaze, clutching her rabbit tighter. She didn't cry, didn't speak. But Eleanor saw it. The moment the innocence cracked, just slightly. The moment she understood that the world wasn't always kind. Edward, standing between two officers, watched the scene in silence. For the first time, his arrogance faded completely. "Let's go," Harris ordered. The doors opened, and the morning light spilled inside as Edward was taken away. Eleanor wrapped her arms around Annie, holding her close. Justice had been served. But why did it still feel like something had been lost? The rain had long since ceased, but its memory lingered. It clung to the iron gates of Hamilton Estate, to the damp stone pathways, to the mist curling at the edges of the gardens. The grand house stood in quiet stillness, no longer burdened by mourning, yet not entirely free from the weight of the past. Inside, the air was lighter, the black mourning veils had been removed, and the mirrors, once covered to prevent restless spirits from lingering, were uncovered, reflecting the soft glow of the afternoon sun filtering through the tall windows. Eleanor stood in the center of the great hall, staring at the massive portrait of Robert that still hung above the fireplace. His eyes, painted with meticulous detail, watched over the room as they always had. For the first time, she did not feel like he was looking for answers. There was no need for questions anymore. "Mommy!" The small voice pulled her from her thoughts. Eleanor turned to find Annie standing at the bottom of the grand staircase, her stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest. The little girl hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the door of Robert's study, slightly ajar. She had been standing there for a while, unmoving, silent. "What is it, darling?" Eleanor asked, kneeling before her daughter. Annie's fingers twisted into the fabric of her nightgown. "I thought I heard something," she whispered. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "From where?" Annie tilted her head slightly toward the study. "Daddy's office." A shiver crept along Eleanor's spine, but she took a steady breath. Not fear. Not anymore. She reached for Annie's small hand and squeezed it gently. "Come," she said, "let's look together." The study remained untouched. Robert's chair was neatly tucked under the desk. His bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes he had spent years collecting. A faint scent of old paper and polished wood lingered in the air. And yet, Eleanor could feel it. Not a presence, not something sinister, but a farewell. Annie stepped inside carefully, looking around as if expecting to find something different. But everything was the same. Everything except the phone. The old rotary phone on Robert's desk rang once. Then, silence. Eleanor's breath hitched. Annie's fingers tightened around her rabbit. The ringing had stopped, yet the room felt fuller, heavier, just for a moment. Eleanor crossed the room slowly. The phone had not rung in weeks. With careful hands, she lifted the receiver. Nothing. No voice. No static. Just a soft click. The unmistakable sound of someone finally hanging up. A deep stillness followed. Eleanor stood there, the receiver still warm in her palm. Then, a small, knowing smile touched her lips. "It's time to rest, Robert." She set the phone down gently, as if laying something precious to rest. The house seemed to exhale, its long-held breath finally released. Annie looked up at her mother, searching her face for an explanation. "Who was it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor knelt down, brushing a stray curl from Annie's face. "It was nothing, darling," she murmured. "Just a goodbye." Annie blinked, considering this, then slowly nodded. She pressed her cheek to Eleanor's shoulder, wrapping her small arms around her mother's neck. Eleanor held her tightly, closing her eyes. For weeks, she had been carrying the unbearable weight of grief, of suspicion, of justice that needed to be served. Now she was carrying only her daughter. Later that evening, as the house settled into a quiet peace, Eleanor took one last walk through the halls. The paintings no longer seemed like specters of a life stolen away. The air no longer carried the cold remnants of unanswered questions. She found herself in front of the portrait of Robert again. Annie stood beside her, holding her rabbit in one hand, reaching out with the other to touch the frame. "Do you think he's happy now?" she asked. Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. "I think he finally found peace." Annie smiled softly, stepping back. "Then we should be happy too." Eleanor stared at her daughter for a moment, marveling at her strength, her resilience. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "We should." As they walked up the grand staircase together, hand in hand, Eleanor felt it. The ghosts of Hamilton Estate had finally let go, and this time they would not return. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining.